Good evening. I'm Maxine Weil, the Director of Congregational Learning at Central Reform Congregation, and we are thrilled that all of you have decided to join us this evening. It is going to be a really fascinating evening as we commemorate Yom HaShoah with our midst program with Vera Emmons. I would like to welcome you all on behalf of Central Reform Congregation and introduce our interviewer and tell you a little bit about this program. Nancy Yowitz, a previous board member, chose to make her, during her tenure as a board member, a focus on adult education opportunities. And in doing so, she decided, she reached out to Paul Wagman, and together they created In Our Midst. So each month we have been, during the past few months of the pandemic and moving through the summer, we have been highlighting different members here at CRC. Paul Wagman is going to be interviewing Vera Emmons this evening, and he is a longtime CRC member. He's in his second tour of duty on the board, and he worked for the Post-Dispatch as a reporter for 16 years, where he gained experience asking people whatever questions happened to pop into his head. Then he worked for 25 years at Fleishman Hillard, where he found ways to continue to ask people very nosy questions. And so we look forward to him leading the Q&A at the end of the program tonight. It's important for people to know that with the Q&A, we will not be using the chat room, but there is at the bottom of your screen a place to put your questions and answers, your questions. And at the end of Vera's presentation, he will be bringing those questions into the discussion with her. Please note that there is a thumbs up and a thumbs down, and if you put a thumbs up next to a question, that will prioritize the question. So if you see a question has been asked that you're interested in, hit the thumbs up and that will bring it to the top. We also want to express thank you tonight to Autumn Dennis, who is our new, or I don't know if new anymore, but our recent hire at CRC. They are the Director of Advocacy and Online Community, and we want to thank them for helping to produce tonight. And with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Paul Wagman. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Well, as Maxine just noted, today was Yom HaShoah Day, Holocaust Remembrance Day. And this whole week is known in the United States as the Days of Remembrance. Tonight, we're fortunate to have with us a member of our own congregation who can talk to us about the Holocaust in a very personal way. Vera Emmons has been a member of CRC for nearly 2 years and is actually an employee of the congregation. She's administrative assistant to the education department. Vera's mother, the late Gerda Nothmann Luner, was born in Berlin in 1927 and alone among her family survived the Holocaust. She eventually settled in Chicago, where she met Vera's father, a Polish-born Canadian named Charles Luner, and where she raised 2 daughters. In 1978, she wrote Gerda's Story. This is it right here. You can see it, Gerda's Story. A memoir, the memoir of a Holocaust survivor. Some 24 years later, and 3 years after Gerda's death in 1999, her husband published this short book. I read it a couple of weeks ago and I was very impressed. It tells a horrific story, of course, but it does so in a very understated, matter-of-fact manner, which only increases its power. Vera, our guest tonight, is actually named for Gerda's little sister, also named Vera, who, like the other members of Vera's family, perished in the Holocaust. So it's apparent that Vera's life has really been stamped from the beginning by her mother's experience. This is something she has embraced. Vera, I'm speaking now of Vera Emmons, our guest tonight, is strongly committed to keeping the memory and lessons of the Holocaust alive. She has been a docent at the Holocaust Museum here in St. Louis for about 15 years, and she's spoken to thousands of people about her mother's experiences. So at this point, I'm going to turn the program over to Vera. She has a presentation about her mother that she's going to share with you. It takes between 30 and 40 minutes. At the end of it, I'm going to ask her some questions and then turn the floor over to the rest of you to ask questions. Vera, it's all yours.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, thank you all for being here tonight. Paul was right that I feel like my name gave me a lot of meaning in my life and in my legacy of being part of a family who suffered during the Holocaust. I'm going to start with a letter I received, a piece of a letter I received when I was 1 week old. So this was written on April 11th, 1957. It was written by a friend, good friend of my mother's family from Germany. Dear Vera Adele, your arrival in this world is a great event for your parents, your father's family, and for all those who live with the memories of a recent past, because they know so well the names given to you. They know so well the people who owned the names which you inherit. Someday you will understand, and when that day comes, you will realize the responsibility of bearing the names. While my mother was alive, this was her story, but after she passed away, and after my father put these, her memoir together with adding some pieces of letters that we had, it became my job. So, my family. First of all, what I think is really important here, as we're learning about the Holocaust and studying the Holocaust and teaching our children about the Holocaust, is the problem of silence, of not doing something while there's still time, for not taking a stand. And that's a lot of what happened for many reasons in Germany and in Europe. My grandfather and my grandmother, Max and Adele Nothmann. My grandfather, Max, was a veteran of World War I. He fought for Germany during World War I, and he was a lawyer and became a judge also in Germany. He believed very much in the German political system. My grandmother, Adele, was a housewife. The family lived in a very nice neighborhood in the city of Berlin. My mom on the right was born in 1927, and her younger sister, Vera, was born in 1929. From my mother's earliest memories, Hitler was a constant presence in her life. I'm going to now play the first of several audio-visual video clips of my mother from her Shoah Foundation interview. So this interview took place in one day over several hours in 1995 when my mom was 68 years old. So you can understand how far back she's remembering. So here she is talking about when she was 5 years old, learning that something terrible had happened.
I remember the tense days leading up to the election of April in 1933. I remember the day of the election. I remember where we were at the exact location at in a park that was called the Bayerische Platz, not far from where we lived. We were there when the black, white, and red flag was brought down and the swastika was raised, and people were just screaming with joy, and my parents were there shuddering and very, very subdued. They had not until the last moment really thought that such a person could really be elected.
For my family, changes came very quickly. My grandfather lost his job because Jews weren't allowed to be judges anymore. And my mother began having a difficult time in school. Here she is talking about some memories of grade school.
But I also remember a woman who taught us hand embroidery and knitting and that sort of thing. And her name was Fräulein Bremen. And Fräulein Bremen was viciously anti-Semitic, and it was bad. I also had girlfriends who, after a year, told me that they were not permitted by their parents to associate with Jews anymore. And so, very sorry, but we can't be friends anymore. And many instances like that.
And the identification of Jews, the separating of the Jews, marking them, which didn't start with the yellow star that we all know about, but with identification cards. All Jews from the ages of 6 and up had to carry identification cards, and this is a composite of my family's identification cards. And you can see the look from the looks on their face how different this is from those happy pictures that I showed in the beginning. And the laws that started coming down, so many laws. It's so important, I think, to remember that what was happening was legal. We think of the people who were resisting as doing the right thing, of course, but they were breaking the law. Just a few laws pertaining to Jews. And remember, as I'm going through these, the war didn't start until 1939. Here's Mom remembering those times in Berlin.
The time in Germany, in Berlin, was so horrid. There was the Kristallnacht, and it was just the fires of all the synagogues going, being burned, all the shop windows being broken, everything being looted. It was just an unbelievable situation. And I am told that in many other towns it was even worse than in Berlin.
So it's getting worse and worse. My grandparents are trying very hard to get out of Germany, to get out of Europe. They were doing everything they could and not having any luck. My grandmother, Adele, had 2 brothers who with their wives did get out of Germany pretty late in the game in 1938. And I'm gonna come around to them later. But my grandparents just didn't know what to do. It was so awful. But what they decided to do was, while they were looking for a way out of Europe, they found through a neighbor 2 separate Jewish families in Holland who agreed to take in one to take in my mother and one to take in Vera. The idea was that Vera and my mom would go to Holland, live where it was freer, because of course the war hadn't started yet. This was now June of 1939. And my grandparents would find a way out of Europe, the family would come back together, and off they would go. So in June of 1939, my grandparents, my mother and her sister, said goodbye to each other. And Vera and Mom left for Holland. It was the last time my mother ever saw her parents. She was 12. Mom lived with a family named the Deans in a small city in Holland called Tilburg. She was very happy there. You can see her there with the Dean family. She called them Ma and Pa. She had a foster brother, Klaus, who was a year younger than she, and a foster sister, Helga, who was a year older. And they lived together like a family. My mother was keeping up a correspondence with her parents, and for the first number of months could visit with Vera at her with her foster parents. They could go back and forth on the train during school vacations and the like. Of course, the war started, don't forget, in September of 1939. My mom, though, could be back in school, back in public school. By then, Jewish kids weren't allowed in public school in Germany anymore. She very much preferred public school and was very happy there. She quickly learned Dutch. Here she is talking about life with the Deans.
They were just an entirely warm and loving, and I was part of the family and stayed with them for 3.5 years, and those were the best years of my young life.
I think that's quite a statement to make when you're separated from your family, that it was so bad that these were the best years of her young life. So, the war starts September 1939. By May of 1940, the Nazis invade and quickly take over Holland. At this point, young Vera and her foster family fled to France, and through a series of complicated events, Vera ended up back in Berlin with her parents, but my mother stayed with the Dean family in Tilburg. But life took that same downward trajectory for a second time for my mother. She wasn't allowed to go to public school. There was a curfew, just everything. They couldn't go to the grocery store. Yet she remained resilient. She loved the Dean family and kept up a correspondence with her parents, even through all of this. Her parents were not finding a way out of Europe. They were caught in Berlin. So the years go by. It's now March of 1943, and Mom is 15 years old. Not quite 16. Her birthday was at the end of May. But she gets a letter from some neighbors of her parents letting her know that they were being deported. Here she is talking about that.
They were on March 3 of 1943, I learned that my parents had been picked up in Berlin, and my sister, who
How
had
did you find out about this?
Neighbors of theirs in the apartment where they lived at that time, which was no longer the apartment where I had lived, dropped a note and said that they had promised my parents to notify me when this time came, and so they were notifying me.
And you realized what that meant?
And yes, well, I didn't realize that they were going to be killed, but I did realize that they were going to be relocated in the East. I did not realize at the time the horrendous times that they had to suffer in Germany. I did not realize that until later. My parents and I wrote to each other every day, and we mailed these letters once or twice a week. And my parents did not indicate to me the horrors that they went through. They were very, very brave. And the 3rd of March happened to be my foster father's 50th birthday, and we stayed home from school to celebrate. And I got the notification that this letter was waiting for me, so I wanted to run to the post office and get it. And my foster parents said, "Oh, we're celebrating. Don't go. It'll be there tomorrow." And I said, "Well, I'll be back in 10 minutes. And I came back, totally crestfallen. And they had had a letter from my parents, a short note the day before, so they knew. And so that's why they didn't want me to go to the post office and get this letter.
So she knows it's bad. She just doesn't know how bad it is. A few months later, at the beginning of June, just after my mother turns 16, she, along with the deans, were rounded up and told to show up at a train station not far from Tilburg, I assume the next morning. So you can see what the train station looks like now. It's the same train station. There's a plaque on the other side talking about the number of Jews who were collected at this train station and then walked a couple of kilometers to this concentration camp. You can see what it looked like in the 1940s. And if you would go take a tour of the concentration camp today, on the bottom left is a memorial to the Jewish children who are in this concentration camp and taken to the death camp Sobibor to be killed. This concentration camp was not what we call a death camp like Birkenau or Sobibor. It was a labor camp. There were people there who weren't Jewish, for resistance fighters, whatever, common criminals, whoever the Nazis decided to put in the concentration camp. But there were more, the Jews from Southern Holland were starting to come to this concentration camp rather than Westerbork, which is the more famous one in the north of Holland. My mom's ID card from the concentration camp, you can see there the S in her name stood for Sarah. All Jews had to add the name Sarah or Israel to their names. To me, this speaks of this ID card that would have been in the office, just speaks to the bureaucracy of the killing. This was somebody's job to file these cards every morning. And if somebody was deported from here or killed, they took the card out and put it somewhere else. Very shortly after Mom and the deans arrived at this concentration camp, my mother became part of what's known as the Phillips Group. Phillips is the same Phillips Corporation that you all know about. Your light bulbs are probably made by Phillips, or your electric toothbrush or your electric razor. Mr. Phillips wanted to do what he could do to save Jews. The Phillips company was headquarters in Eindhoven, which is not that far from this concentration camp. He, with just a few people, knowing what he wanted to do, went to the concentration camp and told the Nazis there, look, we're making stuff, electronics for the Nazis right now, but we need Jewish women to do this. So we want to find as many, certain number of Jewish women. We're going to do this test for them, and we're going to take them, and they're going to work for us in this concentration camp. Well, what Mr. Phillips really wanted to do was save Jews. My mother was lucky enough to become part of this Phillips group. It saved her life. She was working inside. Mr. Phillips made sure that all the Phillips girls, as they were called, got some extra food every day. He said, look, their hands can't be shaking because they're doing this electronics work. So I'm going to pay for them, make sure they get this extra food. And they were working inside. And they weren't allowed to work a lot of hours. They could only work maybe 8 hours when everybody else was working 10, or 10 hours when everybody else was working 12. And they weren't supposed to do any extra work outside their hours because they had to be very careful of their hands that were doing this very special electronics work. So for the year my mother was in this concentration camp, remember she's 16 years old now, she was somewhat protected. The deans were not so lucky. Here she is talking about the concentration camp and her reactions when the deans were taken away.
It was horrible. It was mayhem. It was so overcrowded that it was totally unbelievable. It was, there were in the barracks, each barracks had 3 tiers of bunks, and each bunk, narrow bunk, would sleep 2 or 3 people, and the mass of humanity, it was unbelievable. And the confusion and the mayhem. And about 4 weeks later, all families with children under 16 were sent to Westerbork, and that included my foster parents and their children. And I desperately wanted to go with them. Klaus was 15. I was just 16. And they wouldn't let me. They said, my foster mother said, Gerda, this is your only chance. And you have been accepted at Phillips, and that is your chance to live. And you're going to have to be strong and do it. And they left, and I stayed, and I died. My brain died. I became stone. I stopped feeling. I stopped being a human being. The shock was so great of losing them and of being alone there. Something very bad happened to me in myself.
I'll come back to that statement in just a few minutes. So Mom is now 16 years old. She's in this concentration camp for a year till she's just now 17 years old. And the Phillips workers were all shoved into cattle cars and taken on a long journey to Auschwitz-Birkenau.
It was, we arrived in the middle of the night, and we could see through the little windows of the cattle cars that the flames were coming out of chimneys, and there was this very strange smell. And we thought this was a labor camp, and this must be how iron ore smells, and we were going to be put to work. And then when the morning came, the wagons were opened, and we all in our striped prison uniforms and without any luggage. And we were in pretty good shape because we were hardened to camp life and we had no possessions. And we came out of the cattle cars, and someone whispered to us, "Don't worry, you'll all be brought into the camp." And we said, so what else is new? That's what we came here for. And looked at him as though he were crazy, and we saw that another very long car cattle car had arrived, and were greeted rather differently from us. They were old men, women, and children coming out of that car, and there were German shepherds, and there were beatings, and there were screams, and then somebody ran along each wagon and said, "Identical twins in here, identical twins in here." But we didn't know what was going on. We were brought into the camp, all of us, and we were brought into a big hall, and we were made to strip, and we sat there stripped for a day, several hours, and then we were given old clothes and didn't realize these were clothes from people who had been murdered. But it just, within a few hours, it filtered through where we were and what was happening. It didn't take long. And then we were assigned to barracks in Birkenau. And
What were these barracks like?
they were wooden barracks. Birkenau, there wasn't a tree, there wasn't a bird, there wasn't a piece of grass, there wasn't a weed. It was an indescribable place. It was wooden barracks, very large ones. There were just there were tiers in 3 layers, about 2 feet apart, and each tier had a few wooden planks, and each tier we had to squeeze 6 of us into it for sleeping purposes, and we sort of had to be curled into each other sideways to fit in. And if we needed to use facilities at night, there was a cart outside. We would squeeze out of our tier and go and ask for permission to relieve ourselves in the cart in front of the barrack.
In the where?
Sort of a push cart. And then we could, when I did that, I could see the fire shooting out of the chimneys around, because we were right near the crematoria, and the electric wire humming and almost glowing a little bit, and the stars in the sky, the same constellations that my father had taught me about. And I knew by then that my parents had been sent to this camp and killed.
So she had said she died inside, yet she was thinking about the stars in the sky and the constellations that her father had talked to her about. They were held at this concentration camp, and I believe always working, always doing electronics work, not for Philips anymore. They're actually subcontracted. Again, sort of the business of war. Over the next year, almost year, not quite year, she was in 4 more concentration camps. So she was in a total of 6 different concentration camps, and finally liberated just before her 18th birthday. So almost 2 years in concentration camps. This last concentration camp was near Hamburg, which is number 10 on the map. Here she is talking about her liberation.
When we couldn't even move from our beds anymore, from our bunks anymore, suddenly we were told to get into trains again, and we really most of us couldn't even move from the bunks anymore. And we were carried into the trains. And these were cattle trains that were left open, and there was hay on the bottom of it. And we were off. We went to Denmark, and that was just before the end of the war, several days before the end, maybe May 3 or something like May 2, something like that. And we were free.
So she's free. She's now a survivor. The group, or part of the group, was brought from Denmark to Sweden, to Malmö, Sweden. The Swedish government had said that they would take in a number of refugees to bring them back to health. Here's from a couple of sentences from the diary of a Dutch woman who was in Sweden waiting for Dutch refugees, which my mother was considered. So here's a translation of what she wrote as the boat was coming, or docking. But we did not see any Dutchmen. We only saw a large gypsy group of indescribably slumped, skinny, pale-skinned individuals, filthy, in rags, the one without stockings, the other with burlap rags, a ragged mess. So Mom was in this hospital, and she was lucky to be in a hospital. A lot of people who survived the war died soon after because very well-intentioned people gave them food that was too rich for their systems. You can see in a few months, she's already looking a lot better, at least externally, right? But she had to decide where to go. This was not an invitation to stay in Sweden. She was 18 years old. She had lost her family. She had lost her family, the Dean family, and she had to figure out where to go. Coming back to those two brothers, or my mother's two uncles who had gotten out of Germany, both of them with their wives had ended up in Richmond, Virginia. My mother, along with all of the Deans and the rest of my mother's family in Europe, had memorized their address in Richmond as a way to get in touch after the war. This was going to be where they could all write a letter and figure out where everybody was. So when she was able, my mother wrote a letter to her uncles, let them know that she was the only one left, and would they sponsor her to come to the United States? Which of course they did. They really didn't have much money at all. My mother, I don't think, ever knew who sponsored her trip from Sweden to the United States, but the Swedish government gave her a special passport. She was stateless. She was a citizen of nowhere. She came to the United States very, very early on as a refugee. She came here speaking no English. She spoke German, she spoke Dutch, and she already spoke a little bit of Swedish, but had to go back into high school, finish high school, and learn English. She then went right on to college. She went to what's now Virginia Tech University in Virginia, Blacksburg, Virginia, and then eventually moved to Chicago, where she got a job at the University of Chicago in a lab, and where she soon after that met my father. I like this picture because she said she died inside, and here she is. It means a lot to me. She and my father got married, excuse me, in 1953, and were married until she passed away in 1999. She did not want to become a mother, a parent. Well, I shouldn't say, I'm saying that wrong. She was worried about becoming a parent. She thought because of her experiences, she wouldn't be able to be a good mother. You can see here where I am at 1 year old, that she loved being a mother and that she was good at it. I have also a younger sister who was born 3 years after I was born, and my mother was very devoted as a mother. I want to spend a few minutes though talking about what she did as her survivor. What was her survivorship like? Many survivors do not talk about what happened to them. For whatever reason, my mother was okay talking about it. And you can see here on the front page of the Richmond paper, just 6 months after she came to the United States. And I think it's also important to note that she was already doing an interview in English 6 months after she got here. She loved going back to Holland. She went back to Germany, never back to Berlin, but that was when I was already an adult. But she did love going back to Holland. So here she is in Tilburg in front of the house she lived in with the Deans. And the next picture is what the house looks like now. And also to bring in the third generation. This is one of my children. All of my husband and my children, my mother's grandchildren, have been to Holland and know very well their family history. My mother and father went to a reunion of the Phillips group in 1990. So my mother got a chance to meet Mr. Phillips. He is considered a righteous among the nations at Yad Vashem. So someone who risked his life to save the Jews, to save Jews, excuse me. And I had the honor of meeting his son a few years ago at the book launch of my mother's biography in Holland. It's unfortunately in Dutch. Only pieces of it have been translated. But it was really a very moving experience for me to meet Mr. Phillips's son, Fritz Jr. And of course, the legacy of a survivor, their family. My dad, who's 95 and listening right now, my sister and brother-in-law who are also listening, and excuse me, and my family. My mother never had the, excuse me, the opportunity to meet. She met all our children, but never had the opportunity to meet our two wonderful sons-in-law. And our older daughter and her husband, it was Evan's idea, took my mother's maiden name as their last name in honor and in memory. I'm gonna conclude now, or let my dad do the conclusion. At the end of this long interview in 1995, my father was called into the room and asked to say a few words. So I'm gonna end with my father speaking, and then I'm gonna stop sharing the screen and be happy to take any questions.
I'd like to tell Gerda that I appreciate that she's doing this for everybody and that people won't forget what happened. And I also want to tell how our whole family appreciates how she brought up the kids. In spite of the horrors, and how she instilled in the kids a sense of the past, and also myself. And the children, I think, appreciate how she related and shared her experiences with them early on so they can have a better understanding of what occurred. And we all appreciate her.
Thank you all for being here.
Vera, that was a really, really moving and fascinating presentation. Thank you very much for it. I'm sure everyone else who watched it feels the same way. I want to start by referring back to you mentioned, your mother having said she died inside, and then obviously she did come back alive to marry your father and to have a successful adult life in America, of which you were a huge part. But while she talks about her experiences, she's very restrained, very matter of fact, as is the book. And one of my questions is that how she was in general, or was that a coping mechanism that she adopted when she was talking about the Holocaust?
She was pretty low key, as I remember it, as a child. I don't remember a lot of screaming, that kind of thing. It wasn't, I think, for lack of emotion. It was just how she handled it. And I don't know if it was affected by what she went through, or if that was just her
way. And maybe it helped her survive too.
Yeah, sure.
Another question I wanted to ask you is, you have presented this now to many audiences, including many young people.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering what kind of reactions you get, especially from the young. Are they stunned? Are they surprised? How do they react?
It's usually pretty quiet afterwards. I know in most of my speakings through the St. Louis Holocaust Museum, the kids tend to ask the survivors more questions right away, because they can ask them, how did you, that kind of thing. I've noticed that I get a lot more response when the kids are writing thank you notes, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And they've had time to process. I get kids writing me letters saying, I'm never going to forget this. I'm going to tell my children about this. I've received many beautiful thank you notes from kids with a lot of deep feeling. I've got a whole book of poetry that one class did in response to learning about the Holocaust and to my presentation.
So it obviously has a big impact, which is wonderful. Yes. I also just wanted to ask you, do you know how many Holocaust survivors are left in St. Louis, and how many people are doing what you're doing? How many second generation survivors are active in trying to spread the word?
So there's about 80 to 100 Holocaust survivors left in St. Louis. Not all, the ones I know are the ones who are active at the Holocaust Museum. More than, but there are other ones out in the community who are survivors, but not attached generally to the Holocaust Museum. What was the other question?
How many people like you?
Now at the museum, we have more second generation speakers than survivor speakers. Maybe there's 10 of us, maybe more, maybe 15. I don't remember. The museum's been closed
too many. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to now turn to the questions that people in the audience are asking. Here's a question from Nancy Kaiser, or Kaiser, I don't know how to pronounce her name. She's Kaiser. She says she wants to first thank you for keeping the story of your mother's family alive. She says talking about it obviously takes an emotional toll on you. How do you manage your own emotions, Vera?
Well, sometimes, like you just saw now, it depends on the day.
Mm-hmm.
It depends how often I've been doing it. If I've been speaking a lot, usually when the museum has been open, I'm doing it 2 and 3 times a week.
Wow.
So it becomes easier.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Another person asked a question. I think maybe you could talk more about this in a way that there's more to this story than the person who asked the question realizes. She says, why was your mother shifted around so much? But why don't you also talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about why your mother believes that she was protected by the Phillips Company? Because I actually found that to be one of the most poignant aspects of your mother's book.
Okay, well, so those are two questions.
Yeah.
What my understanding is of why the Phillips group was moved around so much was because they were working, right? They were doing this factory work, and the commandants in each concentration camp couldn't use these people because they were used otherwise. So they didn't really want them around. They couldn't kill them, and they couldn't use them for slave labor because they were already being used. So they would keep getting pushed around. And from one concentration camp to another concentration camp, my mother says in her memoirs that they found the tables that they had used. You know, they were actually bringing their work tables along with them.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my understanding of why she was moved so much. And they were in the first concentration camp for as long as they were, because Mr. Phillips or whoever was working with them kept making sure that they were there and saying, no, we need them here because they're doing all this great work for us. My mother believed that she got picked to be a Phillips worker because there was a young man whose, I think, father worked for Phillips.
Yes.
I haven't read the book in a little while.
Yeah.
And he liked her. The young man liked my mother. And the young man and his family went into hiding or something like that. And my mom felt like she got picked, even though she was a little bit clumsy and actually German, although her Dutch was perfect by then, because the boy told his father, who told somebody at Phillips, that my mother should be picked. In the end, I think what really happened was Phillips was taking as many people as they could. But I don't think my mother knew that. I think that I can't remember when I learned all these different things.
Uh-huh. Yeah. But that young man was quite smitten with your mother.
Yes, he was.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
And he was it's a very poignant story. He was a very shy, a little bit awkward fellow. Okay, let's see what else we have here. Rudy Nissenbaum is asking if you can speculate as to what your mother would have thought about what's going on today in Georgia with the voting, the new law in the Georgia legislature. And what would she have thought about the man that President Biden refers to as
former guy. Yes, that's what we call him at our house too. I think she would have been scared out of her wits. I think it would have been a very, very scary time for her.
Yeah. I know another woman that I know who was a survivor out of Vienna, was just completely beside herself during all the Trump years. I'm sure that happens a lot. Okay, let's see. Here's an interesting question from Rory Mazzio. How does your mother's experiences affect her relationship with her Jewish identity? Does it affect your relationship with your Jewish identity as well? And if so, do you feel comfortable talking about it?
I think my mother was always a questioning person. Her family was not observant. They were German Reformed Jews, Jewish certainly, but not observant in most any way, that's my understanding. And she says in the book, at some point she realized that Hitler killed her family and everybody else, because they were Jewish. So she resolved, I think the way she puts it is to be an atheist Jew. So that was, she was always Jewish. Didn't care so much about holidays, for instance, that kind of thing, or ceremony, but certainly Jewish.
Right. And what about the impact on you?
Yeah, I think I was, and my sister also, sort of interested in learning about Judaism and being Jewish, and appreciating the ritual more than my mother did, maybe. But still approaching it maybe with her eye.
Right. Vera, here's an interesting question from Martina Reese. She says, adults often shield children from information that will traumatize them. How did your mother convey her story to you when you were a child? Looking back, do you remember becoming gradually aware of what she and others experienced? What are your earliest memories of learning about your mother's story? And how do you transmit your mother's story and European Jewry to your own children?
So, and Martina knew my mother, I have to add that, and did the artwork for the memoirs. It was just always something I knew about. I don't remember not knowing. It began as learning about my mom talking to us about her family. It wasn't banged over our heads about how much she suffered. That was never part of it. She did tell me, and I assume my sister, things that happened, but it was mostly as a way for us to learn about her family and learn about the Deans, who she also considered family. A lot of, at this point, it's sort of mixed up in my head, what I learned from my mother, what I learned from the memoirs, and what I've learned since she passed away. And my children also all, I think that was part of the question, right? Our kids who are now adults, I don't know. It was just part of their knowledge of their family. Only our oldest daughter has independent memories of my mother, but we've taken them all to Holland. They've read the memoirs. They passed the memoirs around. And they've all written about my mother, and they've all approached it in different ways, I think. From their own ways.
Right. Here's a question from Eric Friedman, and I'm going to add to it a little bit. Eric asks, do you tell the story of our countries, of the United States, lack of response to the war and the death camps and not bombing the rail lines that serve the camps? That's the first part of this question. And I want to add to that. I mean, did your mom talk about that? And was that something that she, that was a sore point hardly does it justice, but is that something that she held against the United States, perhaps?
Yeah. So the first part of the question is, when I'm speaking about my mother, I keep it pretty straight on that.
Yeah.
That's my job, is to personalize everything that happened. So I don't talk about those other issues about the train lines and, the immigrants being able to come in. Somebody might learn about that, though, in a tour of a Holocaust museum.
Right.
Certainly. And I think, yes, it did, because my grandparents were desperately trying to come somewhere, and they thought they were going to go to Chile, and they thought they were going to go somewhere else, and they thought they were going to be able to come to the United States, and the United States wasn't letting in many Jews. And it did give her a real mixed, in my memory, a mixed opinion, not opinion. I mean, she was glad to be here. She came here,
Mhm.
But she also knew that the United States wasn't letting in people when maybe they, and I would say they should have been, right? That, and,
Right.
and she knew that, and she knew her parents and sister were killed because of that,
Mhm.
that they could have been saved, they could have been let in.
Right. Well, Vera, there are no more open questions.
Okay.
So I want to close by reading to you and to everyone an excerpt from the proclamation that President Biden issued last Sunday, designating this week as the days of remembrance of the victims of the Holocaust in the United States. I think it's a really terrific proclamation. Here is a portion of what the president said. The legacy of the Holocaust must always remind us that silence in the face of such bigotry is complicity, remembering, as Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote, that there are moments when, quote, indifference to evil is worse than evil itself. That's what you kind of said in the beginning, but here's how the president goes on. Those who survived the Holocaust are an inspiration to every single one of us. Yet they continue to live with the unique mental and physical scars from the unconscionable trauma of the Holocaust, with many survivors in the United States living in poverty. When I served as vice president, I helped secure federal funding for grants to support Holocaust survivors, but we must do more to pursue justice and dignity for survivors and their heirs. We have a moral imperative to recognize the pain survivors carry, support them, and ensure that their memories and experiences of the Holocaust are neither denied nor distorted, and that the lessons for all humanity are never forgotten. Holocaust survivors and their descendants, and each child, grandchild, and great-grandchild of those who lost their lives, are living proof that love and hope will always triumph over murder and destruction. Every child and grandchild of a survivor is a testament to resilience and a living rebuke to those who sought to extinguish the future of the Jewish people and others who were targeted. Vera, he's talking about you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation tonight. Good
Thank
night,
you
everybody.
for being here.